In the dark space between dead stars, nothing moved for a very long time. A large metal object drifted alone, cold and silent, its surface covered with dust from thousands of years of floating without a home. Inside this object, a single light blinked, over and over, sending the same signal into empty space. No one had answered that signal in a very long time. But one day, a fleet of ships crossed through that quiet region, and everything changed. The ships belonged to the Skarn Dominion, a growing power that ruled hundreds of worlds. They were searching for new land, new metals, and new stars to claim. Their scanners picked up the strange metal object drifting among the stars, and the fleet commander ordered a team to go inside and study it. The team that went inside was led by a small, sharp-eyed scientist named Island. She had spent her whole life studying old languages and lost civilizations. When she stepped through the broken doors of the ancient object, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. The walls were covered with strange symbols, cracked and worn, but still readable if someone knew how to look. Island spent hours going through old data records stored inside the structure. Slowly, she began to understand what she was looking at. It was not a ship. It was a beacon, a warning post, built to send one single message across the stars. She translated the words carefully, checking them twice before she believed what she read. Do not challenge humans. At first she thought it might be a joke, or maybe a threat left by some forgotten pirate group. But as she dug deeper into the broken records, she found pieces of old reports, battle logs, and casualty numbers that made her blood run cold. According to the records, an empire once existed that was larger and stronger than the Skarn Dominion. That empire tried to expand into human territory. Within a few short years, that empire no longer existed. Island brought her findings to Grand Admiral Torvash, the commander of the fleet. Torvash was a proud man who had spent his whole career winning easy victories against weaker species. He listened to Island's report with a bored expression, then laughed. "This is old propaganda," he said. "A story left behind by a dead race, trying to scare us. There is no such thing as an empire that fell in a few years. Every war takes decades, sometimes centuries. This is nothing but fear tactics." Island tried to explain that the technology used to build the beacon was far more advanced than anything the Dominion currently used, even after all these years of decay. She pointed out that whoever built it clearly had the power to make it last for centuries without failing. But Torvash was not interested in details. He wanted new territory, and he wanted to be the one who claimed it. He sent a report back to the Dominion capital, describing the beacon as nothing more than an old superstition from a dead civilization. Emperor Drow, always eager for new land and new glory, approved a plan to send scout ships past the boundary marked by more of these strange beacons, straight into the territory beyond. Island did not agree with this decision, but she had no power to stop it. She kept a copy of the old records for herself, hoping to find more answers before it was too late. As the fleet prepared to move forward, she stood alone in the beacon chamber one last time, staring at the blinking light that had been sending its warning for longer than her entire civilization had existed. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "I hope you are wrong, old machine." But deep down, she was not so sure. The Skarn fleet moved out days later, dozens of warships gliding silently through the dark, crossing invisible lines marked only by faint signals no one on board bothered to fully translate. They believed they were entering empty, unclaimed space, ready to be taken by whoever was strong enough to grab it. They did not know that on the other side of that boundary, sensors had already picked up their arrival. Quiet alarms began ringing in stations that had been sitting silent for generations, stations built by people who had never forgotten the cost of war, and who had spent centuries preparing quietly, just in case someone ever decided to test that old warning again. Far away, on a small human world called New Haven Colony, a woman named Reeves looked up from her morning reports as a soft chime rang through her office, a signal she had only read about in old training manuals but had never expected to hear in her lifetime. Somewhere out past the edge of human space, something had crossed the line. The message on her screen was simple and clear. Unknown fleet detected. Beacon boundary crossed. Condition yellow. Reeves stared at the words for a long moment, her hand tightening on the edge of her desk. Then she reached for her communicator and called the fleet command post. her voice steady despite the tightening feeling in her chest. "This is Governor Reeves of New Haven Colony," she said. "I need to speak with Admiral Bennett. Right now?" Far above the planet, in the quiet dark of space, the first ripples of a war that would shake the galaxy had already begun to spread. Ships that had been sitting quietly in hidden shipyards for years began to wake up, one by one, their engines humming softly as crews rushed to their stations. None of them knew yet how big this would become. All they knew was that after generations of peace, someone had finally decided to test the old warning. And humanity had never forgotten how to answer it. The boundary between human space and the rest of the galaxy could not be seen by eye. No wall marked it, no fence, no glowing line showed where it began or ended. Yet every ship captain who came near it knew exactly where it was, because old star charts marked it in red, and a string of ancient beacons still hummed along its length, repeating the same warning they had repeated for centuries. Most captains steered far away from that line without ever asking why. The Skarn Dominion fleet did not. Grand Admiral Torvash brought his ships through the boundary with the confidence of a man who had never lost a war. His scanners showed a small human colony ahead, a modest cluster of farms and low buildings spread across green fields, with only a handful of old defense satellites in orbit. It looked nothing like the terrifying empire described in the beacon's old records. It looked like an easy target. On the ground, Governor Reeves stood at the edge of her colony's central square, watching the sky through a pair of old field glasses. Word had already spread through New Haven Colony that strange ships had entered orbit. Farmers stopped their work in the fields. Children were pulled inside by worried parents. Reeves kept her voice calm as she gave instructions over the colony's speaker system, telling everyone to stay indoors and remain patient, even though her own heart was pounding. High above the planet, Admiral Grace Bennett arrived with the border fleet only hours after Reeves' first call. Bennett had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this kind of moment, running drills, studying old battle records, and training new officers who had never seen real combat. She had hoped she would never need any of it. Now, looking at the Dominion ships spread across her scanners, she understood that hope had run out. Bennett did not order an attack. Instead, she opened a communication channel and sent a clear, simple message to the Dominion fleet. "This is Admiral Grace Bennett of the United Human Fleet. You have entered protected territory. Withdraw immediately, and no harm will come to your ships. This is your only warning." Aboard his flagship, Torvash listened to the translated message with a mixture of amusement and irritation. He turned to his officers and laughed, telling them that the humans sounded more like nervous shopkeepers than warriors. He believed the warning was nothing more than a bluff from a weak, frightened people trying to protect a colony they could not actually defend. Island, standing quietly near the back of the command deck, did not laugh. She had read too many of the old records to find any comfort in Bennett's calm tone. To her, that calmness sounded less like fear and more like patience, the kind of patience that came from being certain of victory. She tried once more to speak up, suggesting they respect the warning and turn back before anything happened that could not be undone. Torvash waved her off without even looking in her direction. He wanted to test the humans, not retreat from them. He gave an order to one of his smaller warships to move forward and destroy an old, unmanned listening outpost drifting near the colony, a small structure with no weapons and no crew, simply to prove that the humans could not stop him from doing as he pleased. The Dominion warship broke formation and moved toward the outpost, weapons charging. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. 3 human ships, hidden earlier using advanced cloaking systems that the Dominion sensors had completely failed to detect, appeared suddenly around the attacking warship. Before its crew could even finish charging their weapons, precise strikes disabled its engines, weapons, and shields, one system at a time, with almost surgical accuracy. No lives were lost. No explosions lit up the sky. The ship simply went dark, drifting helplessly, completely at the mercy of the human fleet. A tow line was attached moments later, and the disabled Dominion warship was pulled slowly back across the boundary, returned to Torvash's fleet like a broken toy handed back to a careless child. Bennett sent one final message along with it. "We did not want this fight," the message read. "We still do not. But if you attack again, the next ship will not come back in one piece." Silence fell across the Dominion command deck. Officers who moments earlier had been laughing now stared at their screens without speaking. Island felt a cold weight settle in her chest as she watched the disabled ship drift back into formation, untouched by weapons fire, yet completely defeated all the same. Torvash's face turned dark with anger and embarrassment. He refused to see the event as a warning. Instead, he saw it as a personal insult, a humiliation delivered in front of his entire fleet. Rather than reconsidering his plans, he became more determined than ever to prove his strength, convinced that the humans had simply gotten lucky with one clever trick. Island tried one last time, quietly approaching him after the others had left the command deck. She reminded him of the old records, the empire that vanished, the technology far beyond anything the Dominion possessed. She told him this was not luck. This was exactly what the beacon had tried to warn them about. Torvash stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he turned away without answering and ordered his fleet to prepare for a full assault on the colony below, determined to erase the memory of his humiliation with a show of overwhelming force. Far below, Governor Reeves received Bennett's report and immediately began preparing her colony's shelters for what was coming. She had hoped the warning shot would be enough to end things peacefully. Watching the Dominion fleet regroup in high orbit, weapons systems glowing to life across hundreds of ships, she understood that hope had already failed. The first real battle of the war was only hours away. Dust rose from the fields of New Haven Colony as trucks rushed farm workers toward the underground shelters. Children clutched their parents' hands as they hurried down long metal stairways, the sound of their footsteps echoing through tunnels that had been built generations ago and never once used for their true purpose. Above them, the sky had begun to fill with the shapes of Dominion warships, hundreds of them, spreading out like a slow-moving storm cloud blocking out the morning light. General Hale stood near the entrance of the main shelter, watching the sky with a hard, steady expression. He had trained for a moment like this his entire career, running endless drills that most people assumed would never be needed. Now, watching the enemy fleet gather overhead, he felt no fear, only a grim readiness. He turned to the soldiers gathered around him and gave a single order. Get every civilian below ground, then get to your positions. We hold this colony. In orbit, Admiral Bennett watched the Dominion fleet spread into attack formation and felt her stomach tighten. She had hoped Torvash would think twice after losing one ship without a fight. Instead, it seemed his pride had only grown stronger. She opened a channel to her own fleet and spoke calmly to her officers, reminding them of everything they had trained for. We are outnumbered, she said, but we are not outmatched. Hold your formations. Trust your training. Protect the colony. The battle began without warning. Dominion warships opened fire in a massive coordinated strike, hundreds of energy weapons lighting up space above the planet. Human shields absorbed the first wave, flickering but holding steady, thanks to defense technology built from decades of careful preparation. Bennett's ships answered with precise, controlled strikes, targeting engines and weapon systems rather than trying to destroy entire ships outright, just as they had done with the lone warship earlier. Torvash watched from his flagship, expecting his greater numbers to overwhelm the human defenses within minutes. Instead, his fleet began losing ships at an alarming rate, not through massive explosions, but through careful, disciplined strikes that crippled vessel after vessel without wasting unnecessary firepower. It felt less like a battle and more like being slowly picked apart by an opponent who somehow always knew exactly where to strike. On the ground, a group of Dominion landing craft broke away from the main fleet, descending toward the colony in an attempt to capture ground and force a quicker surrender. General Hale had expected this move and had already positioned his forces in the surrounding hills, hidden among rocks and trees using camouflage systems built specifically for this kind of defense. When the landing craft touched down near the edge of the colony, Dominion soldiers marched out expecting little resistance from a small farming settlement. Instead, they were met with coordinated defensive fire from positions they never saw coming. Hale's soldiers used the terrain to their advantage, striking quickly and falling back before the Dominion troops could organize a proper response. Within an hour, the landing force had been pushed back to their damaged ships, suffering heavy losses without capturing a single building. Above the planet, the battle had turned into a disaster for the Dominion fleet. Ship after ship drifted away from the main formation, disabled and helpless, while the remaining vessels struggled to maintain any kind of coordinated attack. Torvash's officers began quietly suggesting retreat, their earlier confidence replaced with growing alarm as their fleet continued shrinking before their eyes. Torvash refused to accept defeat easily. He personally took command of a strike group and led a desperate charge directly toward Bennett's flagship, hoping that destroying the human commander would break the fleet's resistance. Bennett's ship absorbed the attack with reinforced shields while smaller human vessels moved in from the sides, surrounding Torvash's strike group in a tight, coordinated trap. For a tense moment, it seemed as though Torvash's ship might break through. Then, in a final coordinated strike, human weapons disabled his flagship's engines and weapons systems entirely, leaving him drifting helplessly in the middle of the battlefield, surrounded by human ships that could have destroyed him completely but chose not to. Bennett's voice came through his ship's communication system, calm and steady despite everything that had happened. "This battle is over," she said. "Withdraw your remaining ships, or we will finish what you started." Torvash sat in silence, staring at the wreckage of his once mighty fleet scattered across the space around him. Dozens of his ships drifted uselessly, disabled but intact, a clear message that the humans could have destroyed them entirely and had chosen restraint instead. It was a humiliation far greater than the loss of a single warship earlier that week. With no other choice, Torvash gave the order to retreat, gathering what remained of his battered fleet and withdrawing back across the boundary in disgrace. Behind him, New Haven Colony remained standing, its people safe in their shelters, its defenders victorious against a force that had outnumbered them many times over. Back on the Dominion homeworld, news of the defeat spread quickly through the capital. Island, who had stayed behind during the battle, brought the full battle reports directly to Emperor Drow, along with the old historical records she had translated from the beacon. She explained everything clearly and carefully, describing the discipline, the restraint, and the terrifying precision the human fleet had shown, even while heavily outnumbered. "This was not luck," she told him. "This is exactly what happened before, according to the old records. If we continue this war, we may lose far more than a few ships." Emperor Drow listened to her report with a troubled expression, but pride and political pressure from his own council made it difficult to simply walk away from the conflict now. Word of the defeat had already spread among rival powers watching the Dominion's every move. Retreating now would mean losing face in front of the entire galaxy. Instead of stepping back, Drow began planning something far larger than a single fleet. If a small scouting force could not defeat the humans, he decided, then a full invasion would. Far away, on New Haven Colony, General Hale walked slowly through the damaged streets as families began emerging from their shelters, grateful but shaken. He knew this victory would not be the end of the war. It was only the beginning. Deep beneath the old Capitol Library on Earth, rows of data crystals sat untouched for over 100 years, stacked on shelves that stretched farther than any single room could hold. Few people ever visited this place anymore. Most of humanity's history from the old war had been summarized, simplified, and taught in short lessons that left out the harder details. Daniel Cole was one of the few who still believed those details mattered. Cole was a historian, quiet and careful, the kind of person who preferred old records to public speeches. When news of the battle at New Haven Colony reached Earth, he was not surprised the way most people were. He had spent years studying fragments of the old war, the one that had convinced humanity to build the beacons and seal its borders in the first place. He had always suspected that history was not truly finished, only paused. Using old access codes passed down through generations of archivists, Cole pulled crystal after crystal from the deep storage vault, searching for anything that might explain why an empire like the Dominion would risk everything to test a warning that had survived for centuries. What he found surprised even him. The old war had not simply been a defensive struggle. It had been the moment humanity learned exactly how far it was willing to go when survival was at stake, and exactly how quickly it could adapt once pushed into a corner. Cole compiled his findings into a detailed report and sent it directly to Fleet Command, hoping it would help Admiral Bennett and General Hale understand what they might soon be facing. Far above Earth, in a quiet command station overlooking the planet, Bennett read through his report late into the night. occasionally pausing to reread certain sections twice. Meanwhile, on the Dominion homeworld, tension filled the halls of Emperor Drow's council chamber. News of Torvash's defeat had already reached rival empires across the galaxy, and whispers of Dominion weakness were spreading fast. Drow paced back and forth in front of his advisors, his patience worn thin by the constant pressure surrounding him. "We cannot simply walk away from this," one advisor argued. "If we retreat now, every neighboring power will see it as weakness. They will move against our borders within the year." "Then we do not retreat," Drow replied sharply. "We finish what we started, properly this time." Island, standing near the back of the chamber, tried once more to voice her concerns. She reminded the council of everything she had learned from the old beacon records, the discipline shown by the human fleet, and the terrifying speed with which they had adapted to Torvash's attack. She warned that sending a larger force without fully understanding human capabilities could lead to an even greater disaster. Her warnings were largely ignored. Drow had already made his decision. He ordered the full mobilization of the Dominion's military, calling together fleets from every corner of the Empire, along with newly built warships still fresh from Dominion shipyards. Within weeks, thousands of vessels began gathering at key staging points near the human boundary, forming the largest armada the Dominion had assembled in generations. On Earth, similar preparations were already underway, though on a much smaller scale. Admiral Bennett called an emergency meeting with General Hale, Governor Reeves, and several other colony leaders, laying out everything Cole's research had uncovered alongside updated reports from the battle at New Haven. The mood in the room was serious but calm, the kind of calm that came from people who had spent their whole lives quietly preparing for a moment they hoped would never come. "We knew this day might arrive eventually," Bennett told the group. "Our ancestors built this fleet, trained these officers, and maintained these defenses for exactly this reason. Now it is our turn to prove their preparation was not wasted." Hale outlined new defensive strategies based on lessons learned from the first battle, while Reeves coordinated with other colony governors to strengthen shelters and evacuation plans across human territory. Shipyards that had spent years quietly producing vessels for training and defense shifted into full wartime production, building new ships at a pace few outside the military ever realized was possible. Cole continued his research even as preparations accelerated around him, determined to uncover anything from the old war that might help humanity's chances. Late one evening, while reviewing a badly damaged data crystal, he discovered a detail that made him sit up straight in his chair. The old war had not ended through overwhelming force alone. It had ended when humanity found a way to strike directly at the heart of their enemy's supply lines, cutting off the massive invading force from the resources it needed to sustain such a large campaign. He immediately brought this information to Bennett, suggesting that a similar strategy might work again if the Dominion Armada proved too large to face head-on in open battle. Bennett studied his notes carefully, already beginning to form a plan built around patience, precision, and careful timing rather than simple brute strength. Weeks passed as both sides continued preparing. On the Dominion side, Torvash, still bitter from his earlier defeat, requested command of a strike group within the new armada, determined to reclaim his reputation. Drow granted the request, though he placed more experienced commanders in overall control of the invasion, unwilling to risk everything on pride alone this time. Finally, the massive Dominion armada began moving toward the human boundary, thousands of warships stretching across the darkness of space like an unstoppable tide. Sensors along the human border picked up their approach days in advance, giving Bennett's fleet enough time to prepare final defenses around key shipyards and colonies. Standing in her command station, watching the incoming fleet numbers update on her screen, Bennett felt the weight of what was coming settle firmly onto her shoulders. This would not be a small skirmish like New Haven. This was a full invasion, larger than anything humanity had faced since the old war Cole had spent years studying. She turned to her officers, her voice steady despite the enormous pressure building around her. "Send the signal," she said. "It is time to show them exactly why that beacon was there in the first place." Never before had the Skarn Dominion gathered so many ships in one place. Thousands of warships stretched across the darkness of space, engines glowing faintly like a field of distant fireflies stretched out over an area larger than most star systems. Commanders across the Armada spoke confidently among themselves, certain that no force in the galaxy could stand against numbers this large. Somewhere in the middle of that massive formation, Grand Admiral Torvash watched the human boundary grow closer on his screen, determined to erase the memory of his earlier defeat. The target of the invasion was a heavily fortified human shipyard hidden within an asteroid field near the edge of human territory, one of the largest production centers humanity had built during generations of quiet preparation. Dominion scouts reported strong defenses surrounding the area, but nothing that seemed capable of stopping a force as large as the one now approaching. Overall Fleet Command believed that sheer numbers alone would overwhelm the shipyard's defenses within hours. What the Dominion scouts had failed to detect were the layers of preparation hidden throughout the surrounding asteroid field, built carefully over months following the battle at New Haven Colony. Admiral Bennett had spent every available resource turning the region into a carefully disguised trap, using the natural cover of scattered asteroids to hide minefields, sensor jammers, and small strike groups positioned exactly where they would do the most damage. As the Dominion Armada entered the asteroid field, their formation naturally spread out to navigate around the scattered rock formations, unknowingly breaking their tight defensive structure into smaller, more vulnerable groups. The moment the last ships entered the field, Bennett gave the order to activate the hidden minefields, catching entire sections of the Dominion fleet in sudden, devastating explosions that tore through unprepared shields. Confusion spread quickly through the Dominion ranks as ships scrambled to reform their formations amid the chaos. Before they could properly recover, human strike groups emerged from hidden positions among the asteroids, striking quickly at damaged and isolated vessels before retreating back into cover, using hit-and-run tactics that made it nearly impossible for the larger Dominion ships to fight back effectively. Torvash, watching the chaos unfold across his tactical display, refused to accept that the battle was already slipping away from him. He rallied a group of his strongest remaining ships and pushed forward, determined to break through to the shipyard itself and force a decisive victory through raw aggression. His ships tore through several human defensive positions, driven by his stubborn refusal to lose a second time. During the fighting, Island's transport vessel, caught in the crossfire while attempting to reach Torvash's flagship with updated intelligence reports, took heavy damage and was left drifting helplessly among the wreckage of destroyed ships. A human strike team, moving through the battlefield to secure disabled vessels, discovered her ship and brought her aboard as a captive rather than leaving her stranded in the dangerous asteroid field. Island expected harsh treatment as a prisoner of war. Instead, she found herself treated with careful, professional respect, questioned firmly but fairly by human officers who seemed more interested in understanding the Dominion's reasoning than in punishing her personally. During one of these conversations, a young officer showed her old records from humanity's own archives, detailing the war that had led to the beacon's creation in the first place. For the first time, Island read the full story from the human side, rather than relying only on fragments recovered from the ancient beacon. She learned how humanity, faced with near-total destruction by an overwhelming invading force generations ago, had been forced to adapt faster and fight harder than anyone believed possible, ultimately turning the tide of that war through discipline, unity, and quiet determination rather than raw power alone. The beacon's warning, she now understood, had never been a myth or propaganda. It was simply the truth, recorded plainly for anyone willing to listen. Meanwhile, the battle raged on above the asteroid field. Torvash's strike group finally broke through the outer defenses, bringing his flagship within sight of the shipyard itself. For a brief moment, victory seemed possible. Then Bennett sprang the final piece of her trap, revealing a hidden reserve fleet that had remained completely powered down and undetected throughout the entire battle, waiting patiently for exactly this moment. The reserve fleet surrounded Torvash's remaining ships from every direction, cutting off any possible retreat. Overwhelmed and outmaneuvered, his strike group suffered devastating losses within minutes, their formation collapsing entirely under coordinated human fire. Torvash's own flagship took heavy damage, its weapons and engines disabled in a final, decisive strike that left him drifting helplessly once again, exactly as he had after his first defeat. across the rest of the battlefield. The remaining Dominion fleet, already battered by the minefields and hit-and-run attacks throughout the asteroid field, began a chaotic retreat, abandoning any hope of capturing the shipyard. What had begun as the largest invasion force in Dominion history ended as a scattered, broken retreat, leaving behind hundreds of destroyed or disabled ships among the asteroids. News of the disaster reached Emperor Drow within hours, delivered by shaken officers who struggled to explain how such an overwhelming force could have been defeated so thoroughly. Drow sat in silence for a long time after hearing the full report, the weight of the defeat settling heavily over the chamber. Aboard a human medical vessel, Island watched through a small viewport as wreckage from the battle drifted silently through the asteroid field, a field that had once seemed like the perfect hiding place for an invasion and had instead become a graveyard for the Dominion's ambitions. She thought back to the blinking beacon light she had first discovered, still broadcasting its ancient warning after all those centuries, and finally understood exactly why it had never stopped. The old empire had learned this lesson the hard way, generations ago. Now, it seemed, the Dominion had learned it as well. Wreckage drifted quietly through the asteroid field for weeks after the battle ended, slow-moving pieces of broken hulls turning gently in the darkness, lit only by the distant glow of nearby stars. Recovery ships moved carefully among the debris, human crews working alongside a small group of Dominion prisoners who had volunteered to help identify salvageable technology and recover the bodies of the fallen. It was quiet, careful work, done without anger, though the memory of the battle still hung heavily over everyone involved. On the Dominion homeworld, Emperor Drow faced a council chamber filled with tension unlike anything he had experienced before. The destruction of the invasion armada had shaken the Empire's confidence deeply, and reports of the defeat had already spread to rival powers eager to take advantage of Dominion weakness. For the first time since the war began, Drow understood that continuing the conflict would not restore the Empire's strength. It would only guarantee its collapse. After days of difficult discussion, Drow made the decision his advisors had been too afraid to suggest earlier. He ordered a diplomatic envoy prepared, tasked with traveling directly to Earth to request formal terms of peace before the situation grew any worse. Island, recently returned from human custody after a prisoner exchange, was asked to join the envoy given her deep understanding of both the ancient records and the humans themselves. The journey to Earth took several weeks, during which Island spent much of her time reviewing notes she had gathered during her time as a guest of the human medical staff. She had come to understand something the rest of the Dominion still struggled to accept. Humanity had not won through overwhelming aggression or endless resources. They had won through patience, careful preparation, and a willingness to show restraint even when restraint was not required of them. It was a different kind of strength than the Dominion was used to measuring. When the envoy ship finally arrived in Earth's orbit, it was met by a small honor guard of human vessels, professional and composed, showing neither excessive hostility nor false friendliness. Admiral Bennett and Governor Reeves greeted the Dominion delegation personally at a neutral space station built specifically for the meeting, a quiet, simple structure far removed from the grand ceremonial halls the Dominion typically used for diplomatic events. The negotiations were direct and businesslike. Bennett and Reeves laid out clear terms, firm but fair, requiring the Dominion to withdraw permanently behind the ancient boundary, return any captured territory or resources, and agree to a formal non-aggression treaty enforced through regular communication between both governments. There were no demands for excessive reparations, no attempts to humiliate the defeated empire further than the battlefield already had. The Dominion delegation, led by a senior diplomat rather than Drow himself, initially attempted to negotiate softer terms, hoping to avoid the appearance of complete surrender. Bennett remained calm but unmovable throughout the discussions, reminding them gently but firmly of exactly how the previous negotiations by force had ended for the Dominion's fleet. "We are not interested in conquest," Bennett explained during one of the final sessions. "We never were. Every ship, every colony, every soldier we have exists for one purpose, protecting what is ours. If your empire respects that boundary, there will be no further conflict between us. If it does not, the outcome will be the same as before." After several days of careful discussion, The Dominion delegation agreed to the terms, signing a formal treaty that would be carried back to Emperor Drow for final approval. Island, watching the signing ceremony quietly from the back of the room, felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease, aware that this peace had come at a tremendous cost that neither side would soon forget. In the weeks that followed, news of the treaty spread quickly across the galaxy, carried by trade ships and diplomatic channels eager to understand exactly what had happened along the quiet human boundary. Rival powers who had once considered testing that same boundary themselves quietly reconsidered their plans, unwilling to risk facing the same fate as the Dominion's shattered invasion fleet. Daniel Cole's historical research, originally intended only to help prepare humanity's own defenses, was eventually shared publicly through diplomatic channels, offering other civilizations a clearer, more honest account of what had happened during the ancient war and the more recent conflict with the Dominion. For the first time in generations, the old beacon's warning was no longer dismissed as myth or propaganda across most of known space. It was simply understood as fact. Back on the Dominion homeworld, Island was placed in charge of a newly formed research division dedicated to studying human history and culture, an assignment she accepted eagerly despite the difficult circumstances that had led to its creation. She began working to ensure that future generations of Dominion citizens would understand exactly why the ancient warning had been written, rather than dismissing it the way Torvash once had. Torvash himself, stripped of his command following the disastrous invasion, retreated quietly from public life, rarely speaking of the battles that had ended his career. Whatever pride had once driven him seemed to have been replaced by a quiet, uncomfortable understanding of exactly how close his ambition had come to costing his empire everything. On New Haven Colony, life slowly returned to normal. Farmers returned to their fields, children returned to their studies, and Governor Reeves resumed her quiet daily routines, though the memory of those tense early days remained close beneath the surface for everyone who had lived through them. General Hale continued overseeing the colony's defenses, no longer surprised by how quickly peace could be interrupted, but grateful that preparation had made the difference between survival and disaster. Far beyond the boundary, the ancient beacon continued its endless broadcast, still drifting quietly among the stars where Island had first discovered it. Its message had not changed in all the centuries since it was first recorded, and it would not change now. But its meaning, once dismissed as an old and forgotten legend, had finally been understood by an entire generation who would carry that lesson forward. Ships that passed through that region of space now gave the boundary a wide, careful distance, no longer out of fear alone, but out of genuine respect for a promise that had proven, once again, to be exactly true. Do not challenge humans. For a long time to come, no one did.